Minister, thank you very much for your presentation today. The contribution that you have made in terms of building partnership with local government on issues that are complex but critical to the future of New Zealand is very much appreciated by Infrastructure New Zealand, and the partnership that we have enjoyed with you as a Minister to advance those complicated discussions has been valuable to us and important for New Zealand. So we very much appreciate you being here and for sharing your insights about where to from here, because you spoke about the need to be bold and to be visionary and to share the interests of all New Zealanders in the future growth of the country. And infrastructure is a fundamental platform for that. And so I'm sure we all here support you in your ministry. Thank you for your presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, today Infrastructure New Zealand launches its latest thought leadership report, Building Regions, a vision for local government planning, law and funding reform. It has just been made available on our website, and I would encourage you all to download it, read it, absorb it, and provide feedback to Infrastructure New Zealand on whether or not you support or have ideas for new ways of thinking about how we deliver and build our regions into the future. This morning, Sir Selwood explained how he had helped lead the formation of a northern powerhouse. I would like to share a vision of how we might, between us all, create a southern powerhouse. To do that, I want to cast your minds forward to what a future might hold if we indeed had the vision, political courage, and fortitude to implement the recommendations in the report that we have released today. And I would just like you to help frame your mind. Sorry. And cue the video clip, please. Ladies and gentlemen, it's the 22nd of August, 2035. 10 years ago, on this day, the New Zealand Parliament passed two new laws, the Development Act 2025 and the New Zealand Environment Act of the same year. These two new laws have now become the foundation for New Zealand's prosperity and our global reputation for environmental sustainability. They were enacted by an unprecedented multi-party consensus across the New Zealand Parliament. This was made possible by collaborative national discussion on the transformation of New Zealand's planning laws, our central and local government institutions, and the way that they are funded, and this took place in the 3 years preceding the legislation being enacted. By 2019, there was universal acceptance that New Zealand's planning laws were delivering poor outcomes across New Zealand. Totaling 1,358 pages of gobbledygook, the acts were a tangle of complex and often contradictory processes. Managing this system were a multitude of government departments, actually 845 of them, Crown entities and SOEs, and 78 regional, city and district councils with populations ranging from 1.7 million in Auckland to just 3,500 people in Kaikoura district. But in 2019, there was intense opposition to any suggestion that things might be structured more effectively. As the wiring of the governance in the Bay of Plenty region shows, relationships between government, regions, districts and communities were tortuously complex. Many councils, particularly those in rural New Zealand, were struggling to maintain their existing assets, let alone invest for the future. Even strongly growing regions like Auckland, Queenstown, Tauranga, Hamilton and others were unable to fund and finance the infrastructure needed to support growth. It was clear that reliance on property rates was not a sustainable method of funding, and the system created perverse incentives. The way the rating system worked, councils would calculate their costs and allocate these over their population on the basis of land or capital values of property. Growing regions had the advantage because they had more people to share the costs against, but the costs were enormous. And where populations were declining, as they were in many districts, fewer and fewer people were having to carry a higher and higher cost on an individual basis. There was an affordability crisis in many areas. While governments and businesses liked growth because it meant more sales and more income tax, GST, and company tax, for council, the growth was a problem to be managed rather than an opportunity to be grasped. Growth meant more infrastructure was needed, meaning more increases in rates and more political risk. Consequently, many councils deferred investment for as long as they could, passing large infrastructure deficits on to future generations. To compound matters further, the legal, administrative and funding systems were almost completely disconnected. In growing cities, councils would prepare district plans under the RMA process, zoning new areas or allowing increased density to allow room for housing. This created opportunities for land bankers to buy and sit on land, waiting for it to be rezoned for residential and commercial development, and then reap enormous non-taxed capital gain. Meanwhile, many Aucklanders and many New Zealanders were increasingly struggling to afford even basic homes. In Auckland, the median home price of a home had increased up to 10 times the median household income. In other areas, the housing affordability disease was starting to spread across the country. While GDP growth was reasonable and unemployment low, GDP per capita was weak. The New Zealand minimum wage was high by international standards and increasing, needing to do so to meet rising costs of living. Labour productivity was stagnant or declining and well below OECD nations, and income inequality was well above the OECD average. Homelessness was high and social rental housing stocks low. The RMA handled the district and city planning process, but investment in roads, public transport and water services was decided under the Local Government Act and the Land Transport Management Act. These laws involved different consultation and decision-making rules and timeframes, and were not always synced with the RMA planning process. Councils primarily relied on taxing existing residents and developers who were generally not too happy to pay increased rates or charges. Unsurprisingly, infrastructure always lagged growth, resulting in significant social and environmental costs. Meanwhile, councils were facing major upgrades to meet drinking water standards and wastewater standards, as well as manage storm and floodwater waters and face significant climate change risks. Boil water notices were a plague across the nation, as were water restrictions in summer months. In 2016, a contaminated water supply in Havelock North was linked to 4 deaths and widespread illness across the community. Across the country, up to 34,000 people were contracting gastrointestinal illnesses annually from drinking contaminated water. Evidence of councils' inability to cope was everywhere. If ever there was a burning platform, it was there. Every 3 years, the local government New Zealand commissioned a comprehensive independent survey of 3,000 people and businesses to understand how communities viewed what councils did and what needed improving. Of major concern, the overall reputation score in 2017 was just 29 out of 100. No matter how hard councils tried, and try they did, and they were earnest in their endeavours, the system was against them. Funding was insufficient for the task at hand. User charges were not used to best effect, if at all. There was no congestion charging on roads. Charging for water based on consumption was the exception rather than the norm. Consequently, and unsurprisingly, roads were heavily congested at enormous social and economic costs, and councils were investing in water treatment and wastewater plants, while ratepayers blissfully wasted water and moaned about ongoing increases to their property rates. Meanwhile, businesses were getting more and more frustrated by the incessant delays to approvals via the planning system. And perhaps of greatest concern, New Zealand's premier environmental statute, the Resource Management Act, was not delivering for the environment. In 2016, the Environmental Defence Society undertook a groundbreaking study into the effectiveness of the RMA and concluded that the Act had largely failed to deliver the goal of sustainable management. The good news, ladies and gentlemen, is all of that changed in 2025. That was the year the reforms were put in place. The newly enacted Development Act reinforced the way that local government was structured and funded. This Act brought together the district planning components of the RMA and the planning, funding and processes in the Local Government Act and the Land Transport Management Act into one law. After extensive community consultation, 14 new regions were established across the nation. Each region was required to develop a long-term social, cultural, and environmental and economic development plan, the regional plan, to be updated every 5 years. The plan set out a 30-year vision and strategy for spatial development for each region. Unlike the bad old days when councils defined their future by the size of their purse, now councils could decide what they wanted to achieve and then determine how they would fund it or finance it. Funding followed strategy, not the other way around. That required them to think much more proactively, conduct robust business cases, raise debt and sell assets, and sell their proposals to their constituents. The plan included a forecast of investment in regionally significant infrastructure in the form of a 30-year strategy, a 20-year forecast, a 10-year plan, and a 3-year budget. The plan designated environmental protection areas, transport utility corridors, and locations of significant cultural interest. The funded infrastructure plan provided certainty for the development sector and capital markets. It was key to incentivising investment in skills, capital equipment and technology, which unlocked the productivity of the construction industry. Aggregated at a national level, regional plans both informed and were informed by the equivalent plans developed by national agencies like the Ministry of Education, Health, Transport, and Transport New Zealand, the nation's new transport agency, and others. Collectively, national and regional plans were signed off by Parliament as the New Zealand Development Plan. For the first time, New Zealand had a fully integrated system where planning, funding and delivery were aligned and linked nationally, regionally and locally. Regional government received a share of GST. This was the dividend provided to councils for agreeing to structural reform. It was fundamental to gaining buy-in for such significant change. In return, central government enjoyed the dividend from growth from the regional economies. It was a city or regional deal at a national scale. Much greater use was made of user charges to fund investment in infrastructure and services. The combination of user charges, economies of scale, cross-subsidisation from large communities to small, and technology enabled rapid improvement in water, roads and amenities across the country. Instead of managing costs, regional government was incentivised to grow social, economic and environmental prosperity across their regions. Their remit was over the whole region, town and country alike. Slowly, the old us and them town and country prejudices were broken down when they realised they were dependent on one another. Having regions focused on enabling growth also focused a strong relationship with business. Councils and business were now partners in growth. Private capital was leveraged much more effectively to enable investment. Improving economic prosperity provided funding for social and cultural development programs that had always been beyond reach in the past. The basis for calculating property rates was shifted from the cost allocation method to a percentage charge on the value of land. As values increased, so too did local government income. Not only did growth pay for growth, but councils received a direct dividend from the value that they and business and communities created in partnership. Transport functions were developed to regions. Transport New Zealand, the new transport agency, monitored the performance of regional transport bodies for compliance with national standards and promoted best practice across the system and ensured a consistent standard level of service and benchmark performance between regions. Established as a state-owned national water regulator, New Zealand Water monitored performance of 5 corporatised water service delivery companies, benchmarking quality and prices nationally and internationally. The Infrastructure Commission, established earlier in 2019, oversaw the provision of infrastructure services across the country. The Commission's function was to report to Parliament on whether or not the infrastructure system was delivering for New Zealand and what needed to be done to fix the problems. While regions looked after regional development, community councils were established as the beating heart of local democracy. In the country, each town had its own elected community council. In cities, the community councils were formed by identifying real communities of interest centred on town centres within each city. Community councils became the eyes, ears and voice of the local community on regional and national issues. But their primary mission was building social cohesion, working with relevant agencies and charitable bodies to address drug, alcohol problems, vandalism, homelessness, domestic violence, unemployment, and other social issues. They partnered with local business, schools, sports, philanthropic groups to build a true sense of community. They focused on placemaking local streets, parks, reserves, main street programs, and building community identity. People became the centre of their world, not pipes in the ground, as they had been before. Finally, I'd like to explain how the Environment Act sought not only to protect the environment, but to enhance it. The Act set up a National Environmental Protection Agency as the National Environmental Regulator. Its mission was to enable sustainable development, not just sustainable management of existing natural resources, but to also lead the improvement of fresh and seawater quality, soils and biodiversity. Its initial task was to lead a national discussion to agree New Zealand's environmental standards and set longer-term goals. These established the environmental bottom lines for all activities across New Zealand. Instead of being seen as a barrier to progress, the environment became seen as a national asset to be protected, fostered, and improved over time. Looking back 15 years, it's hard to understand why it took us so long to reform our clumsy legal and institutional and funding system, but reform of this kind takes time. Let me just walk you briefly through how this change was achieved. By mid-2019, the government had already set out an ambitious wellbeing agenda. It had commissioned the Productivity Commission to undertake a review of funding. It had established the Infrastructure Commission. In the same year, it appointed the Resource Management Review Panel. In 2020, the government passed legislation to set up Kaingora Homes and Communities, a national urban development agency, and it passed the Infrastructure Funding and Financing Act, which accelerated private financing of infrastructure for housing development at scale, where residents paid for infrastructure by a levy on their properties. And New Zealand Water was established in the same year to regulate the price and quality of water services across the country. The newly elected government in 2020 took these initiatives to a new level. One of their first acts was to plan for and implement road pricing in Auckland to coincide with the opening of the Central Rail Link. This dramatically increased revenue into the Transport Fund and enabled much more efficient use of the transport system by managing mode and time of travel. We have now just completed the rollout of road pricing across the country. But the 2020 masterstroke was the redevelopment of the Provincial Growth Fund into a $6 billion regional development fund, $2 billion a year over the next 3-year term. Under this scheme, regions received a share of the fund if they collaborated across districts, community, iwi and business to develop a coherent development plan. The plan needed to be supported by evidence-based investment program with key milestones and performance outcomes built in. The fund provided the stimulus for growth through collaboration and partnership. As the government enjoyed the dividend from growth, regions developed confidence in the benefits of collaboration. The time was ripe to develop the legislation that delivered structural and funding reform 3 years later in 2025. The integration of the planning and delivery into one coherent statute set in the Development Act was a game changer. But equally, the Environment Act placed environmental sustainability at the forefront of decision making and ensured that not only were we protecting the environment, we were committed by law to improve it over time within an agreed framework. The national vision sought to develop the country as an interconnected community, celebrating knowledge, diversity and opportunity, working within the ecological limits of the nation to nurture social and economic prosperity, creating a country that will be enjoyed forever. Now, as we begin the development of our next 30-year rolling plan, we can look forward to the future with confidence, buoyed by the success of the last decade. Building on these foundations, there's no doubt we have an exciting future ahead of us. Thank you.